1.4 note, we're going to be solving quadratic equations. Does anybody know what a quadratic equation is? What does it mean to be quadratic? So quadratics have the x squared in it. So we're going to be solving equations with x squared. So there's going to be a few different techniques that we're going to use. The first one, we're going to solve by factoring. Whenever we solve by factoring, we need it to be equal to 0 before we start solving. So do I have my equation here equal to 0? No. How do I get it equal to 0? Subtract 24. So let's put it in standard form. When we do that, we have x squared plus 5x minus 24 is equal to 0. Once it's in standard form and equal to 0, we can factor. So what are two factors of negative 24 that add to 5? Positive 8 and negative 3. Perfect. So this factors into x plus 8 times x minus 3. And then the last step, after we factor, we just set each one equal to 0. So each little parentheses gets set equal to 0. And then we solve from there. So x plus 8 equals 0, and x minus 3 equals 0. Subtract 8 in the first one, so x equals negative 8. Add 3 in the second, so x is equal to 3. No, just x equals. On WebAssign, I think when you have two answers, and most of the time you will have two answers, it wants you to input it as like a comma separated list. So you would just say like negative 8 comma 3, like to list your answers in WebAssign. Next, we're going to be solving quadratic equations by completing the square. So when we complete the square, we have this little formula that we use. It is b over 2 squared. So this is the formula that we use to complete the square. So first step when completing the square, I'm going to keep the x's on one side and move the number to the other. So I'm going to subtract 13, just move it to the other side, get it out of the way. So we have x squared minus 8x. I'm going to leave a space there to complete the square, and it's equal to negative 13. So I'm going to keep the x's on one side and move the number to the other. Now, in that space, that's where my formula comes in handy. That's where I put the b over 2 squared. What do you think my b is? Negative 8. The number that's in front of the x, so the one in the middle. So we have negative 8 over 2 squared. What's negative 8 over 2? Negative 4. And what is negative 4 squared? Positive 16. So I just pulled this 16 out of nowhere and put it in my equation. So I also have to add 16 to the other side just to keep my equation balanced. So since we're adding 16 really out of nowhere, we got to make sure we add it to the other side to keep our equation balanced. And then when we complete the square, we're going to have parentheses squared. In those parentheses, we take the x, since that's squared, and the negative 4, since that is also squared. So the x and negative 4 go into our parentheses squared. So x minus 4. And then that's going to be equal to 3. Negative 13 plus 16, which is 3. So we completed the square. Now we have to finish solving. So I'm trying to get the x all by itself. What do you think I need to do next? We're not foiling because that'll take us back to the original question. Square root both sides. We're going to get rid of that squared, so I'm going to square root both sides. So cancels out with the squared. So we're just left with x minus 4 is equal to what? Plus or minus square root 3. Anytime you take the square root of both sides, you need the plus or minus. And then what do you think the last step is? add 4. Again, we want to get that x all by itself, so I just have to move everything to the other side. So I'm going to add 4 to move it over. Can I combine 4 and square root 3? No, so we're just going to leave it as 4 plus or minus square root 3. We can't add them together, and we like it when the whole number comes first. Our standard form puts the whole number first, so just put it right in front of the plus or minus. So this would be our answer. On WebAssign, I don't think that they have a plus or minus option, so you would put your answer as 4 plus square root 3, comma, 4 minus square root 3 when you list out your answers. So you just have to write it twice. So this is how you'd put your answer on WebAssign. All right, let's complete the square again. So let's do it with B. What should we do first here? Take out the GCF. Anytime you have a GCF, you want to take that out first. What's our GCF? 3. I'm going to divide everything by 3. And when our GCF is just a number, it goes away. Because what's 0 divided by 3? 0. So it goes away. So we're left with x squared minus 4x plus 2 equals 0. Now, do I have two factors of 2 that add to 4? No. So that tells us that we can't just factor normally. We have to factor either completing the square or quadratic formula, which we'll talk about on the next slide. But let's complete the square here. What's the first thing that I need to do to complete the square? Move the 2 to the other side. So we have x squared minus 4x. We're going to leave a space to complete the square, and it's equal to negative 2. What's our little formula that we use to complete the square? It's just b over 2 squared. But what's our b here? Negative 4. So negative 4 over 2 squared. What's negative 4 over 2? Negative 2. So negative 2 squared. What should I do next? What is negative 2 squared? So I'm technically adding 4. I have to add it to the right side too. Got to keep the equation balanced. So now in my parentheses squared, what am I going to put? X minus 2 squared. Perfect. And then that's equal to what? 2. Negative 2 plus 4 is 2. Any questions so far? We completed the square. Now we just have to finish solving. What should I do next to solve? Square root both sides. So square root cancels out the squared, so I'm left with x minus 2. What's that equal to? Plus or minus square root 2. Need the plus or minus anytime you take the square to both sides. And then what's our last step? Add 2. So how would I write my answer? X equals what? 2 plus or minus square root 2. Awesome. So next, we're going to talk about our quadratic formula. So we have 3 different ways of solving quadratics. 1, we could factor. If it doesn't factor, we may need to complete the square. Or we could use the quadratic formula. Any one of these techniques will work. Sometimes it doesn't factor, so you may have to complete the square or use the quadratic formula. But even if something does factor and you use the quadratic formula instead of factoring, you'll get the same answer. It'll simplify down to whole numbers. So any of these 3 will work, except if you can't factor, you have to move on to the other 2. So our quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a, where a is the number in front of your x squared, b is the number in front of your x, and c is your constant. So in order to use the quadratic formula, it has to be equal to 0 before you figure out what your a, b, and c are. Once you find your a, b, and c, just plug them in and simplify. So looking at number A.
Number A?
Yeah. Example 3A. We're going to use our quadratic formula, so I'm going to write it on the top. For us, our quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of what? B squared minus 4ac over 2a. Awesome. So in A, what's our A? 3. What's our B? Negative 5. And what's C? Negative 1. Perfect. Let's plug it in. So we start with negative 5 plus or minus the square root of b squared, which would be negative 5 squared, minus 4 times 3 times negative 1 over 2 times 3. When simplifying, I think it helps just go left to right on top. Just simplify one step at a time. So what's negative 5? Positive 5. So 5 plus or minus, what's 5 squared? 25 minus, it turns into plus 12. Perfect. Technically, negative 4 times 3 times negative 1 would be positive 12. Over 2 times 3, 6. So let's simplify this a little bit more. 5 plus or minus the square root of 37 over 6. Can I simplify the square root of 37? No, 37 is prime. So we can't break that down. And then can I divide the whole numbers? No, no common factors there. So this would be our final answer. We can't simplify it anymore. So we are done here. So always check to make sure that you can't simplify anymore. You have to simplify completely. Let's look at B. So what's our A and B? 4. What's our B? And C? 9. Do we have any GCF that we could divide out, make our numbers a little bit smaller? No. If you do, take it out. Again, it'll make the numbers smaller and make this easier. If you don't take out the GCF to start, it'll just end up simplifying a lot more. But I would say if you have a GCF, divide out the GCF, make the numbers smaller. It'll make simplifying it easier. So we have negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c over 2a. So negative 12 plus or minus the square root of 12 squared minus 4 times 9 over 2 times 4. So let's simplify. Negative 12 plus or minus the square root of, what's 12 squared? 144 minus, what's 4 times 4? And 16 times 9? 144 over 2 times 4, 8. So negative 12 plus or minus the square root of 0 over 8. What's the square root of 0? 0. So lucky for us, this whole thing goes away because it's just 0. Plus or minus 0 is just 0. So we're left with negative 12 over 8. Can we simplify this? To what? Negative 3 over 2. Perfect. So that would be our answer. Let's do C. Again, let's solve with the quadratic. What is our A? Awesome, it's 1. It's not 0 because we have that x squared there. It's the coefficient in front, which is 1. What's our B? What's our C? 2. Let's plug it in. Negative B, so negative 2 plus or minus the square root of B squared, which would be 2 squared, minus 4 times A times C, so 4 times 1 times 2, over 2 times A, so 2 times 1. Next, let's simplify. Negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 2 squared is 4 minus 8 over 2. Let's simplify a little bit more. Negative 2 plus or minus the square root of negative 4 over 2. What is the square root of negative 4? 2i. And what does the I mean? Imaginary numbers. We're not dealing with imaginary numbers, so if you have a negative under the square root, that means that there is no solution.
On the website, is it give an option for no solution?
You have to type in, it says if there's no solution, it tells you type in no solution. So if you have a negative under the radical, that means that we have an imaginary number, which means no solution. We're not going to deal with imaginary numbers yet. All right, last slide. Well, last 2 slides. We're going to talk about the discriminant. So the discriminant is just a number that tells us how many solutions we have. Our discriminant formula is everything that's under the radical in our quadratic formula. So under the radical, we have b squared minus 4ac. So that is our discriminant formula without the radical. So it's just everything under. If our discriminant is positive, that means we have 2 real solutions. If our discriminant is negative, we have 1 real solution. If our discriminant is 0, we have 1 real solution. And if our discriminant is negative, then we have no real solutions. So just like in that last example we did, the number under the radical ended up being negative, and what was our answer? No solution. So if your discriminant is negative, that means you have no real solution. If it is a positive number, you have 2 real solutions. And then if it's 0, you have 1. So in example 4, we're using the discriminant to determine how many real solutions each equation has. So our discriminant formula is b squared minus 4ac. We find our a, b, and c just like we did with the quadratic formula. So in A, what is our A? 1. What's our b? And c? -1. Perfect. So let's plug it into our discriminant formula. We have b squared, so 4 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, -1. So 4 squared is 16. What is -4 times 1 times -1? Positive 4. And 16 plus 4? 20. 20 is our discriminant, but there's 2 parts to the answer. We also have to say how many solutions we have.
1 solution.
If our discriminant is positive, how many solutions do we have? 2 real solutions. So there's 2 parts to this question. You have to name the discriminant and determine how many solutions. Well, like to find the solutions, you have to use the quadratic formula. Or you could factor it if it factors. This doesn't factor. So you'd either complete the square or use the quadratic to find the solutions. 20 isn't a solution. That's just our discriminant. And because it's positive, it tells us that for B.
0. What are we doing with 0?
Well, let's work it out. What's our A?
4.
B is?
Negative 12.
And C? Let's plug it in. So negative 12 squared minus 4 times A, so 4 times 9. Negative 12 squared is 144. Negative 4 would be negative 144. Awesome. And 144 minus 144 is 0. So our discriminant is 0. How many solutions do we have? 1 real solution. So again, 0 is not our solution, but that is our discriminant, which tells us we have 1 solution. All right, let's look at C. Fractions. We love fractions. So what's our A? And our B? And C? Perfect. Let's plug it in. B squared would be negative 2 squared minus 4 times A, which is 1/3, times C, which is 4. So negative 2 squared is 4 minus, what's 4 times 4? And 16 times 1/3? We'll say 16 over 3. Remember, multiplying fractions, if we have 16 times 1 over 3, we just multiply straight across. Now, how do we add or subtract with fractions? We need a common denominator, so I'm going to make it 4 over 1. And what would our common denominator be? 3. So I have to multiply the top and the bottom by 3, so this becomes 12 over 3. And what's 12 minus 16? So negative 4 over 3 would be my discriminant, and if it's negative, no real solutions.